Hey, my name is Joey, and I'm a designer working over at Twitter on design systems. Now, before joining Twitter just a couple of weeks ago, I spent about 16 months over at Figma, and at Figma, I was working as a designer advocate. While I was at Figma, I loved creating content to help other designers feel more confident and comfortable in the tool, and I want to keep doing that. So today, I want to talk about something that I care a lot about, which is naming conventions in Figma. And the reason I care so much about this topic in particular is because I really think if done right, it can save you a lot of time. And when it comes to working in design systems and discovering and storing and finding components, the right naming structure can provide so much ease of access when designers are looking for components, when you're trying to look for components, or really just kind of storing things away. So there's a lot that I want to get into today. Maybe you're someone who's been using Figma for a long time, or perhaps you're someone who's brand new. I hope there's a little bit that I can share that can help you just work a little bit more efficiently in Figma. Also, if you have any topics you want to see, let me know in the comments below. I would love to continue making these and definitely have a lot of plans for the future, but I want to make sure everything is as relevant as possible. All right, so let's get into it. The first thing that I want to talk about is pages in Figma. And you might be familiar with pages already, but just in case, pages are ways for you to store different elements of your design or different elements altogether in a single file. So I have a couple of demo pages over here on the left-hand side, and in case you don't ever see your list of pages, you can always click this little disclosure icon up here at the very top. Clicking this will reveal all of the different pages that you have. If you create new ones, they'll appear over here at the bottom of the list. So right away, you'll see I have a couple that I tend to use pretty often. So the first one I call cover, and this is a place for me to store a thumbnail inside. Now, a thumbnail is just a 960 by 480 frame, which we'll talk about in just a minute, but it's a frame that allows you to essentially put content on to create a preview of what you want your file to look like. So in this case, I have a frame. Again, it's 960 by 480. And in here, I have a little tag that I can switch out pretty easily, which is just currently says status is completed, but I could go in here and I could type anything else that I want. I could change the color. And I'll actually share out after this. I have a little thumbnail kit that I've made for Figma where I'm pulling these assets from. In here, you can see I have all sorts of different avatars that you can use. You can replace Figma's logo with your own company logo. And I created a couple of these kind of predefined statuses. So things like completed, in progress, ready for development, and there's more. So I'm actually using this thumbnail here, and I brought it into my file over here. And to actually set this as the thumbnail, all you have to do is simply right click. And in this case, I've already set it, but for now I'll just choose restore default thumbnail. Once that's done, I can now right click and I can choose set as thumbnail. And you can imagine as you kind of grow in the number of files that you have and as your team kind of expands and gets larger, it's really helpful just to kind of see, again, maybe some statuses, some indicators of who's working on it. If you want to apply some branding, your company logo there, and perhaps a background color that matches your own primary brand color. And I also like to just kind of include the name here, even though it's included in Figma by default. I think just having the name really helps kind of call attention to the file. It's much larger, so if you're maybe not a designer and you're someone who's less familiar with Figma, I think the whole thing just kind of makes it a little bit less intimidating. Okay, so when it comes to creating other pages, there's a little bit more that I like to do. So you can really create an unlimited amount of pages, and you'll see here, we talked about that first one just now, which is my cover page. And next I like to create an about page. I don't have anything in this demo file, but what I'll typically put in here are things like what the project is about, perhaps who's working on it, or any updated context that might help another designer or a non-designer who's taking a look at this file just kind of catch up on what was going on, or who are the stakeholders or deadlines or anything like that. So this is kind of like a metadata page. And again, you can customize these however you want. This is really just how I tend to organize my own files. So next I included a demo page, and this might be a space where you can actually include perhaps like a prototype or kind of a walkthrough of what you're planning to build out, or maybe it's the actual final thing. So next I like to include an exploration page, and this is a space where I can put inspiration or maybe other examples from different companies where they do something really well that maybe they've got a pattern down that seems to work really well that might be something that we can kind of take advantage of. I like putting it in this space, again, called exploration. You could call it inspiration or really whatever you want. It's just kind of a space to really create like a mood board of sorts. All right, so next up, I create a space called Latest Design. I think a page like this is really helpful in your files just because, as we all know, even inside of our files, we can have V1, V2, V3. And it's so helpful for a non-designer or even other designers to come in and know that there's a page in here that will always have the latest design. This isn't anything that's automated with Figma, but it's just something where you can create this page and just as a general practice, being able to put the latest designs or making a habit to put the latest designs in here, I think can just work really well for the entire team. Okay, finally, I have two other pages, and this one here is kind of a feedback/crit space. So perhaps you've shared out the designs with your team. Maybe you're including different pieces of feedback in here. For example, I like to kind of screenshot like Slack messages that I might receive or comments in Slack regarding different ideas or things that maybe I hadn't thought about before when it comes to a design. Maybe you've actually had like a virtual crit, maybe in Figma, and you want to just capture those sticky notes or those comments that were actually documented in the file. This is kind of where I like to put all of those. It's a way to show progress and also for me to refer back to really easily when I'm looking for a piece of feedback or if I just want to gather new ideas. Okay, so this last page here is a page called Handoff, and it's definitely not necessary because I think Figma already does a good job of being able to invite an engineer into your file. And for them to be able to kind of poke around and export the assets that they need and click around while Figma does provide measurements and everything. I just think this space can be helpful for if you have any like assets that absolutely need to be exported, or if you have any notes for the engineer, or if there's any bits about like animations. Really, this is kind of a space for, I tend to think of it like as a space for communication between yourself and an engineer or engineering partners. Okay, so this last one here is a little bit different. This is just a little divider that I created before going into components. And all I did is I clicked the new page icon up here. I did 3 little hyphens and I've got a divider. So it's actually just a blank page, but I tend to create a lot of these just because it can help kind of break up the pages. So if you have different categories of pages, or again, as we're kind of going from these primary pages up here to a specific components page at the bottom, I just think a little visual indicator is pretty helpful. Okay, now for the components page. So in case you're not working with a full-fledged design system yet or lots of team libraries in Figma, I like to include a components page down here at the very bottom, which might just be filled with the local components that are relevant to the design. So for example, if I'm creating buttons over and over again that might not be part of a shared library, but I know that I'm going to be using them throughout the file, or maybe I'm just exploring with a new pattern that I know I want to repeat throughout my design, this is where I'll actually store those. That way, if I'm working with a design systems designer, or if I'm the one kind of putting those back into the design system, I know that this is a space where I can look at and I can easily find all of the main components that I created for this design. And it's kind of just a mental note that everything in here should eventually go back into the design system if it's used, but it's also a way just to kind of store things and again, easily reference. Okay, so what I want to talk about next is the assets panel. So we've been looking at the layer list so far, and as we click around, as we have different elements inside here, we can see down here at the bottom left are all of our different layers. So everything is purple here with kind of this 4 little diamond icon. That just denotes it's a main component. But for example, if I grabbed our shape tool at the top and I drew a square, or a rectangle rather, we have that new rectangle layer up here at the very top. All elements that are a part of your page are going to be in this layer list right here. Now, the thing that I want to call attention to is this assets tab up here at the very top. Think about it as everything related to visual components in your design system. So everything that's been pushed up to a team library or every team library that you're actually subscribed to for your file, you can find all of those elements inside of the assets tab. Now, when we're looking at the Assets tab, we can see right away we have a couple of different dropdowns. These dropdowns pertain to the page list over here, and the ones that are appearing here are ones where you have local components inside. So for example, our cover page here, if we go back to that in the layer list and we click on cover, well, this is actually a component that I'm using, so that's why that's appearing over there. And if we click on the components page here, we of course have all of these main components that are part of our design right here. So if I click on that Assets tab again, I choose the cover page dropdown, we can see right away we have our cover. And if I click on our Components tab here, we have all of our matching components that are on the canvas over here on the left-hand side. So what's really great about the Assets tab is as I hover over these different components, I can see right away their full name. So this is just the name that you've given that component in the layer list. And even more, I can actually grab this and I can drag it right into the canvas and I can work with it. I can go in, I can replace the text, So I can type hello right away. And this is now an instance of a component that I can use inside of my design. What I don't really love though, when we're working with this, is if I'm a designer working in this file, or if I'm bringing other designers in, when we click on the Components tab here, we can see that we have all of our components showing at once. So as you can see, we have a couple of message bubbles up here at the very top. These are all sorted alphabetically. So we can see that down here, we've got our gray bubbles. They're kind of apart from those primary blue bubbles up here. We have this segmented control here, and this is kind of scattered throughout because the ones up top are named dark and the ones down at the bottom are named light. It's also not really easy. Like, let's say we wanted to select, maybe we wanted to select this dark segmented control here. We wanted to bring that in, but then we wanted to really quickly maybe swap this out for one that was left selected or right selected. Well, as it stands, if we go to the instance swapping menu over here on the right-hand side, and we want to swap this out, we're actually seeing all of the components that are over here in this list right here. So it's probably not likely that we would want to instance swap this dark segmented control here for perhaps maybe a blue bubble light, or maybe even we probably wouldn't want to swap this very commonly for maybe a light segmented control that has the left one selected. We want to maybe stick to dark or stick to light. So as you can see, the instance swapping menu over here on the right hand side is just kind of messy. This is a really small file with only a couple of components inside. And you could imagine if you're working in a file that might have dozens or even 100 components in it, this list can get really long, and it's a lot of information for a designer to have to parse if they want to either swap a component out, or if they're just looking to find something. It's just kind of a lot to deal with. So I want to talk about frames for a second and how you can actually use frames to organize these components right away. If you're coming from Sketch, frames are really the equivalent of artboards with one major difference. That difference is that you can actually nest frames with inside frames. So we'll definitely cover what that means in a little bit, but I want you to think of components as actually just frames, because that's essentially what they are. So if we have a frame, so for example, if we grab our frame tool up here at the very top and we choose frame, and then we draw a frame like this, we can actually take an instance, drag it right inside that frame. And as we just said, all components, all instances are really just frames that are repeatable. So in this case, we've brought a instance inside of a frame. So we're nesting frames within frames. Now that's not really important to know right now, but what is important is to know that frames can help you organize these components. So if we go back over here, and I'm just going to clean this up real quick and delete some of these that we brought in. As it stands right now, we have 3 groupings of components. We have these message bubbles up here at the top. We have segmented controls down here at the bottom left, and then we have these modal stacks over here on the bottom right. And as we saw earlier, they're all kind of clumped together in a list, but we want to organize that list. So what I can do is I can actually grab the frame tool up here at the very top, or I can just press F on the keyboard. And I'm actually just going to draw a frame around these components. We've got a frame there. We'll do the same thing for the bottom two. So we'll draw a frame here. And now we'll do it once more and we'll draw a frame here. So right away, let's take a look at actually what changed. So if we collapse our layer list just by doing Option L, we can see that we have 3 frames now on the canvas. And inside of each one of these frames, we have our different sets of components. So if I click on the Assets tab up here at the very top, we can see that now inside of our components page, and if you remember earlier, this was kind of a messy list of components, but now inside of our components page, we have a dropdown with 3 new dropdowns for each one of the frames that we just created. It's not really helpful to see frame 1, frame 2, frame 3, because as a designer looking at this list, you're not quite sure what's going to be inside of each one of those frames. So this is where I want to give each one of those frames a name. So if we go back here, let's go to the top, and I want to name this first one. Let's just call this message bubbles. I'll double click and I will type message bubbles. And before we go any further, let's just go back to our assets list. And at the top, we can see that our frame 1 has now been renamed to message bubbles. So it's much more clear for me as a designer to know, now when I'm looking in here, what's going to be inside. And if we go back, let's do the same thing with these bottom 2. So let's call this frame 3. Let's rename that to segmented controls. And then for our frame 2, let's go ahead and name this modal stacks. All right, so now when we go to the Assets tab, we can see inside of components, we have message bubbles, modal stacks, and segmented controls. And a quick tip here, this is something that I like to pay attention to. I think it's kind of fun just to organize these a little bit more and to make them as visually kind of tight as we can. If we click on message bubbles up here and we go back to our layer list, we can see that if I click one of these and I hold Option, it's not quite centered in that frame. And same below, and that's just because I drew kind of arbitrary sized frames around these components. So what I can actually quickly do is let's click the outer frame here, and I'm going to use auto layout over here on the right-hand side. Just gonna click the plus, and right away we can see that it's tidied all of these up. So we now have a frame around these with a spacing between each component of 32 over here. And it looks like we have a mixed padding, so let's also set this to 32. And now that looks a little bit more visually organized. And I'll do the same thing down here. So segmented controls, auto layout, 32 for the spacing, 32 for the padding, and then modal stacks here, auto layout, 32 for the spacing, 32 for the padding. It didn't make a difference in terms of how we actually discover or find these components, but I think when you're looking at this and you have, again, maybe hundreds of components in all of these different frames, it can just be really helpful to know that the sizing is kind of correct. And if you bring something new in, or let's say we even remove one of these components down here, I'll just hide it for now. But because this is an auto layout frame, watch what happens when I hide it. The frame actually collapses to match everything inside. If I click on this bottom one here and I hold the Option key, it's a perfect 32 and 32 all the way around. So regardless of how many elements I actually have inside or how many I remove, it's always going to stay 32 for the spacing between and 32 for the padding outside. Okay, so we've used frames to organize these a little bit more. And again, if we go to that Assets tab and click at the top here, we can see all of those. However, I think we could do a little bit better of a job, because if we click inside message bubbles here, it's not really clear until I hover over which one of these is meant for light mode and which one of these is meant for dark mode. And for example, let's say I brought one of these in, let's say this blue dark mode component here. Let's say I want to switch this out really quickly for the light version of this. Well, if I click on the instant swapping menu here, I see all 4 of them. And again, it's not too big of a deal when we're only working with 4 components. But you can imagine for something like these segmented controls here, now we're having to look through 10 different components and to try to quickly identify which one we want to switch to based on maybe if we're using light mode or dark mode or the 2 option or the 3 option. So I want to show how we can actually get a little bit more detailed here to make instant swapping easier. So I'm going to click on our message bubbles frame, and let's go back to our layer list here. And if we find our message bubbles frame in our layer list, we can see that these currently aren't named very well. And what I mean by that is we have the dark mode and the light mode set in parentheses, which Figma isn't really able to tell what that means. However, if I want to switch this to the / naming convention, this is going to tell Figma that we're building kind of categories within these components. So let me show you real quick. Let's go ahead and click on this one here, which we know to be our light mode component. And let's click on this one here, which we also know to be our light mode component. All right, so what I want to do is I'm actually going to, first, let's double click in here. I'm going to remove light, delete this, put a /, which again is telling Figma we're creating a new category, and then just type light. And we'll do the same thing here. So we'll double click, we'll delete /light. So now if I click on this component here, let's actually delete that, and I'll grab one of these and just Option drag it over so that we're working with a new light component. So if I click in the instant swapping menu now, we can see that inside of Blue Bubble, we only have the light component. This is perfect. But we're also missing the dark mode here, because when we're working with Blue Bubble, we probably want to see both the light and the dark mode. So let's actually fix that. So if we go back to our layer list over here and we select our gray bubble and our blue bubble again, let's just change this. I'll delete that, put in dark, do the same thing for our gray bubble. Perfect. So now if I select that light instance again of the blue bubble and I go over here, we can see that inside of the category blue bubble, we have dark and we have light. And if I go back, we can see that inside of message bubbles now, which is the frame that contains these, we have both blue and gray. And for instance, if I click in gray, we can choose between dark or we can choose between light really easily. Now, something even cooler is, let's say I'm working with this component here, and maybe I want to change the text. So I'll type hello, and we can actually change our background so it's a little bit easier to see this. So I've got an instance, I changed the text. Let's say I want to actually swap this to the dark mode version of this. Well, if I choose the instance swapping menu and I choose dark here, our override that we just made is completely preserved. And I can actually really easily go back here and maybe I want to swap this for the blue bubble. Well, I can click on that and arrow back again, click on blue bubble. Let's choose our dark mode version of the blue bubble component. And we can see that that override also is preserved here. And how we're doing this is if I go in and I look at the actual structure here, all we have is a layer in here that's called message. And this is something that I manually typed in. So when I was creating this component, I double clicked here and I renamed this. By renaming that text layer, I'm telling Figma that I want this to persist. I want this to be a common text layer, regardless of the instance that we're working in. Okay, so next I want to talk about these segmented controls down here. So if we take a look, each one of these segmented controls is placed inside of that new frame that we created. And just to show, if we go to the Assets tab again, and we choose our segmented controls dropdown, we can see all of those controls kind of clustered together. This is okay, but again, if we had multiple components, it might not be the best. And also it doesn't really make sense to have both our dark mode and our light modes together in this case. So what I want to do is I want to walk through a feature called bulk rename. The bulk rename feature allows you to select multiple different items in your layer list and really easily and really quickly rename them. So for example, what I want to do is if we take a look at the name here, we have segmented control in the name itself, but we don't need to do that because they're already inside of a frame that's called segmented controls. So what I can do is I can click these first 5. And again, I'm just shift clicking to select all of those ones in the range. I can do Command R to bring up the bulk rename menu. And in here, let's go ahead and rename this to light / and I'll show you why in just a second. So as a designer, I can say I'm looking for a light mode version of the segmented control. I can grab one of these, I can drag it right in, and now I can very easily swap it between. But we actually need to give this a little bit more of a name, right? Because we just did light / and we're not really sure which one this is. So let's go back to our layer list here. And let's find these at the top. Okay, so when I look at the segmented controls frame here, I think what I want to do is distinguish these components by the number of options that are available. So for example, in the first 2 here, we have 2 options that could be either on or off. And here we have 3 options that could be either on or off. So what I want to do is I want to take advantage of bulk renaming here to make this really easy. So we'll select the first 2 just by shift clicking. We'll do Command R. And in this bulk rename panel, we can choose our current name. And let's type in our current name and then do 2 options and rename. So now we have light / 2 options, light / 2 options. We'll still have to go in to distinguish whether or not the right one is selected or the left one is selected, but we're getting a little bit further. So if we click on the Assets tab again up here, we can see that we have our components, segmented controls, light, and we've got our 2 here. Now I want to show you how we can actually break these out a little bit more so it continues to make more sense. So let's go back to the layer list and let's choose these here. We'll choose these 3 because each one of these 3 have 3 options available. So we'll bring up our bulk rename panel, choose our current name, and then type in 3 options. So we have light 3 options, light 2 options, all inside of the frame segmented controls. Now when I click on the Assets tab here, we can see that inside of our segmented controls, we have light, and we have our different options here between 3 and 2. So I can actually now pull this in and I can see that we're working with one that has 2 options here, and I can swap this to be one that has 3 options as well. But I want to break this out one more time, again, just to kind of indicate whether or not we're working with one that has the right option selected or the left option selected, or in the case of 3, the center option selected. Okay, so I'm going to select the first 2 here. We'll do light 2 options, light 2 options. Command R. Actually, let's not do that because we want to rename these specifically. So if I click on the first one here, let's just double click in here and type in right selected. And then on this one, we have the left one selected. So we'll do /left selected. Now to show you, if we go to the Assets tab and we go up here at the very top, we can see that inside of our segmented controls light, we have our 3 that are unnamed just yet. We have our light ones inside of light, which have 2 options here. And now if I pull this in, like this one over here, I can say, do I want to swap this between the one that's left selected or the one that's right selected? And I'll just quickly do the same thing for these below just to show you how everything comes together. Perfect, so I have all these renamed now, and if I click on the Assets tab up here at the very top, let's go ahead and collapse this all the way. So we can see if I'm a designer looking for a segmented control, I can click on the components dropdown. I can choose segmented control here. I can now choose between either light or dark. And with these expanded, I can say, do I want a 3 option or a 2 option? And let's say I want a dark mode 2 option. So I'll select this here, and we can now choose either left selected or right selected. And I'll actually pull this in, and we can see on the right-hand side now in the instance swapping menu, I can very easily change again between right selected or left selected. Or maybe I want to back out and I'll go to, let's do one with 3 options, and I can say, let's keep this left selected. And now we've got that picker right there. So just making a couple of changes in terms of how you think about naming, where things are placed inside of frames, or how you're using that / naming convention really can go a long way in terms of how you can actually organize and find those components. Okay, so there's one other thing that I want to share here. So if you're working in a design system, or you're working in maybe just a component library that you're kind of building out, there's probably going to be a time where you're making a component that you don't want to be published when you publish your next series of components. So for example, if we were looking at these segmented controls here, and perhaps I didn't want the 3 option ones to ever be published, or maybe they just weren't quite ready for whatever reason. Well, what I can do is I can select all of these here. I can do Command R to bulk rename again. And let's choose to put a period in the rename along with the current rename. And if I click rename, we can see now in that list, we have a period in front of the 3 that we selected. Everything with a period or an underscore in front of it will not be published to the team library. So this makes it really easy to prevent accidental publishes if you don't want something, or if you're not intending for something to be published or used yet by the team. A lot of times I'll receive a question of how do you change the actual appearance of a component inside of the Assets tab? So for example, if we click on our modal stacks here, we can see that all of these have a white background. And that's probably okay for most components, but sometimes you'll have maybe a white component that isn't visible on that white background. So if we go over here to the modal stacks frame, what we can actually do is click on the frame itself. Over here, it has a background by default of white, but I can actually click on this and we can drag this down a little bit. And as I make it darker, perhaps I want to go maybe a gray like this, just so it's a little bit easier to see. You'll notice the background of the frame matches the background of the preview in the Assets panel list. And this can be really helpful if you're choosing to break your components out by either light or dark mode in these different frames. All of the light mode components can of course have a white background. All of the dark mode components can of course have a darker background, just so that everything appears correctly for any designers who are looking for these components. Okay, so that's all I have for today. Let me know if this was helpful or if there's other topics in Figma you'd like to see. I definitely plan to cover more on components, more on variants, which is a really exciting feature, and then we'll definitely get into auto layout because I know that can be a little bit of a complex or intimidating space. So we'll do some examples there to kind of show how auto layout works and how you can actually apply it to your designs, again, to be more comfortable, confident, and efficient in Figma. Thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you soon.